This is Whitehall Sources. Thank you very much for being with us. You can email anytime. Of course, the email address is hello@whitehallsources.com. Make sure you're following the podcast and you subscribe to the podcast. We're also starting to put things on YouTube. So if you'd like to watch bits of the podcast, we're all very scared about this, then feel free to go and have a little search for Whitehall Sources on YouTube as well. We're on Twitter, we're on Instagram, we're on TikTok for extra clips. Right, we must talk about Gavin Williamson. Gav is gone. As political playbook, hilariously titled.
That is quite good, to be fair. It's not bad.
Is he Gavin a bad day?
Very good. Kirsty used to be a political editor for a Sunday newspaper, of course. That's where that headline writing prowess clearly comes from. Did you ever write the headlines, or am I speaking out of turn?
No, that's the job of the sub-editors.
Fine. Well, you should have written the headlines with that sort of prowess. So yes, Gavin Williams gone. The Enforcer. The Enforcer. This is what he was. But he's really gone because of, sweary text messages that he sent to the Chief Whip. He told an MOD official to slit your throat. He was using an MP's private life as a tacit threat. Various journalists really piecing together lots of bad stuff about Gavin Williamson. The point is he's gone. I guess it's about his behaviour, and it's about what it does for Rishi Sunak, because he made the decision to appoint him in the first place. But he's lost his enforcer as well, which is, or is it, I should ask this, is that a legitimate role, that sort of enforcer-typed person, Kirsty? Is that a valid thing for someone to be and how they operate?
Well, it's a really interesting point, isn't it? You know, Chief Whips throughout the years do their job through a combination of things. It's partly pastoral care, but it's also partly, frankly, knowing where the bodies are buried, and sometimes using that, if you like, in the dark arts to get their way and enforce discipline. That is what the role of a Chief Whip is. However, you know, we are moving as a society into a place where what used to be acceptable or put up with or whatever in the workplace is now no longer seen to be acceptable. You know, if I went into journalism now, you know, the ability to go out at like 11 o'clock and hit the pub and not come back and do my job for the rest of the day, it's just not professional anymore. You know, journalists don't
Calum
go off and
nodding
have
away there as if that's not exactly what he does.
That's the life I signed up to. I was horrified to discover it's not the reality.
It's an outrage. Let's go back to the 80s, you know. But that's the point, you know. Profession, you know, you've had a professionalism of all sorts of areas, including journalism, and politics increasingly is one of those areas where, you know, parliamentary staff, civil servants are quite rightly demanding higher professional standards that go with that. Now, some of the, look, I mean, on one level, am I surprised at the stories that come out about Gavin? No. Gavin was one of those people who particularly loved that kind of House of Cards, Francis Urquhart kind of shtick. He revelled in it. He played up to it. You know, he used to have a tarantula on his desk called Kronos, you know. And he liked this kind of, you know, dark arts role and thought it was fun. But what he missed in all of that was that the world had moved on and he had stayed the same. And the sorts of things that, you know, were acceptable, you know, back in the 80s, or he thought some of it maybe he thought, you know, was part of his shtick and part of his fun. Actually, you know, people don't find that funny anymore. You know, they don't find it acceptable in a workplace. And I think, you know, in terms of all the sorts of things the parliamentary estate have really got to get to grips with, they still haven't got to grips with, you know, the sexual harassment. You remember at the start of the year, I think it was Caroline Wheeler at the Times wrote that brilliant story about 56 outstanding sexual harassment complaints against serving MPs, including some cabinet ministers. They're probably not cabinet ministers anymore, I don't know, or maybe they've gone full circle and they still are, who knows. But you know, what has happened to those? You know, where do parliamentary staff, you know, go when they have complaints? The system has been fixed a bit, but it's nowhere near, I think, the reform it needs to. And, you know, when you get incidents like this, it's just a very quick reminder that actually, you know, what passed for acceptable in politics even 10 years ago is no longer acceptable.
Yeah. I'm quite fascinated, I suppose, by that. First of all, the kind of change in atmosphere, which in this context feels valid and right and good. But just in terms of sort of this role, and there is an element of the game of politics in all of this, isn't there? Which is where you are trying to convince MPs to be on your side or to be against something else or whatever. There's the art of persuasion in all of this. And do you just how that actually works? Is it literally a case of you kind of text the chief whip, or you text somebody who you know knows something about somebody else, and you're kind of trying to get them in to wrangle and to have a quiet word, and well, in Gavin Williamson's case, it would seem like lord some sort of information over them, sort of threaten them or whatever, it would seem from the messages that he sent. Is it literally like that, where there is all of this behind-the-scenes communication, knowing who knows what about whom, and just trying to accelerate that process?
I mean, it's not quite as, on a day-to-day basis, it's not quite as melodramatic as all of that. Most of a whip's work is number crunching and pastoral care. So the chief whip has a deputy chief whip and then a number of whips who all have a flock. And in essence, they ring around their flock of MPs, check how they're doing, anything we can help with, etc. Remind them about vote, take slips so that if an MP can't attend a vote, they arrange for a pairing vote with the other side so that their vote can count. It's a very kind of, on a day-to-day basis, it's a very kind of humdrum sort of environment. However, what tends to happen when an MP gets into a jam, the first thing they do is go to the chief whip for help and support and guidance. And depending on what that is, that might then revolve having the whip removed from them and being referred to the independent investigative body. But most of the work is pretty much kind of pastoral, number crunching, day-to-day business in the House. You need to be here for this vote. It's a 3-line. This is a one-line whip. You can all go home early. It's that kind of stuff, mostly.
Yeah, it's interesting, Oscar. I was considering comments by Ian Hislop this week, or from Ian Hislop this week. Of course, the editor of Private Eye, who's basically saying, the rumours around Westminster are rife, and they are rumours, and that's the thing. A lot of things are just spoken about. People made something up, whatever. They've heard this, they've heard that. But I just wonder if there's kind of grades of knowledge, of insight. So we're talking about Gavin Williamson here, who is a politician. But you guys as advisors, is there quite a lot of that kind of gossipy, rumoury stuff going on there as well? Are there kind of different levels of gossip, I suppose?
Yeah, of course there are. But I think ultimately, and I think, quite often I speak very candidly on this podcast, and occasionally get a bit of rubbish for it and criticism for it, but just purely talking about the politics of stuff and issues. With that in mind, I would say by and large that the gossip that happens and the rumour mill does actually genuinely take a back seat, because you are just being hit over the head with really stressful and genuine important issues of the day. So there isn't a lot of time for it. That was my experience anyway. With Gavin, I would say that what's interesting, I think, here is, operationally, Simon Hart as the chief whip and Gavin kind of being that, I guess, the chief whip kind of lurking around the edges, the unofficial whip. I think operationally is a real loss for Rishi, because it was kind of the perfect good cop, bad cop system. Simon Hart is a really, I know Simon relatively well from when I was working at Number 10, is a really, really lovely guy. And then obviously you'd have Gavin as the inverted commas enforcer. So that's a real, real loss for Rishi. And we look at some of the decisions and the disquiet and the difficulties that November the 17th is going to bring. There's going to be some really difficult votes coming up over the next few months, and someone like having Gavin around would have been useful. The other thing I think about the Gavin Williamson thing, which is kind of odd to me a little bit, is that, you don't want to excuse. It's just you have to. It's like, what is bullying, and then what is kind of almost a self-knowing. Hey, I'm the chief whip. I'm saying something a little bit. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. No, I don't mean it really. That kind of dynamic. And the difference between, is Wes Streeting calling Jeremy Corbyn senile? Is that bullying? Or is that offensive? Or should there be questions asked about that? Sometimes I just don't know where the line is. Speaking to a journalist yesterday at a newspaper I won't name, there was a whole load more to come on Gavin. So I think, ultimately, if it seemed a bit too soon, which to me it did, because I still think it's a Westminster bubble issue, I don't think people down the pub are talking about this bloke they've never heard of saying nasty things about MPs they've never heard of. So I don't think the cut-through thing had happened. So I was surprised that the decision's been taken now for him to leave. But speaking to journalists, there was a hell of a lot more to come.
Yeah, that's my understanding too. I mean, picking up on your point about good cops and bad cops and Simon Hart, I've read a couple of briefings in the paper already that say, is Simon Hart too nice to be the Chief Whip? The common criticism you heard about Wendy Morton, who was the former Chief Whip, who is in the middle of this Gavin Williamson saga because of texts that he sent to Wendy Morton, the chief criticism of Wendy Morton was that she was too nice to be the Chief Whip. So on the one hand, you need party discipline and you need enforcement. And it does kind of, and yes, there are lines and clearly lines of, if what we read is true. And obviously Gavin Williamson says that some of this is not true in its characterisation. But if some of this is true, clearly there are, lines that have been crossed, and by quite some margin. And I take your point about, there's a difficulty with bullying. I accept that. It's harassment is a legal definition and is legally defined. Bullying isn't. Some of this is unacceptable in the workplace, in a professional workplace. I think that is the sort of language which would be helpful right now. It is clearly unacceptable to tell anybody in the workplace to go and slit their throat. Now, you can call that, bullying, or you can question whether that's bullying and it's just a intemperate, appalling fit of rage. But what you can absolutely, I think we can all agree on, is that is utterly unacceptable to say to someone at the workplace. And that is where, that is where I think we would get further in this argument about, what is acceptable in a workplace if we looked at it in that prism. But the Chief Whip role is really, really complicated, and increasingly, I think Mark
Harper?
Spencer. Also got criticisms of bullying, didn't he, during Boris's time? What people used to, and they said, look, politics is a rough old business. It's a bruising kind of game. But clearly there is a new generation of people coming to the workplace who won't find acceptable what the generation before put up with, if you like, and said, well, that's all part of it. Now, they're perfectly entitled to draw the line about, what they find acceptable or not. But I do think it's important that we concentrate on what we call professionalism in the workplace, as opposed to whether something is or isn't bullying. And actually, when you talk about Rishi's standards that he set for his government when he got there, which were about integrity and professionalism, and I think it is that point on which he falls down. I have an awful lot of sympathy with Rishi right now. Everybody says, oh, well, poor judgment, everyone knew about Gavin, etc. I presume, and I don't know, I've not spoken to the team about it, but I presume they have taken a calculated risk to have him inside the tent, because it's safer to have him inside the tent than outside the tent. And that is the difficulty. We get back to the point about trade-offs and compromises, and when you've inherited a very ill-disciplined, factional Conservative Party, you're going to have to make decisions that in an ideal world you would not make.
There's also an argument around this, isn't there, which I think we may have touched on briefly in the past, which is if you bring them in and then you let them do their thing, then actually people make up their own minds, and that's the thing that forces them out. So you've done your bit, you've brought them in as a politically astute move, perhaps, and then within a couple of weeks they crash and burn. But that's through no fault of your own. You did everything you could. Boom, on to the next person, and you've kind of ticked that box. I want to just play you a bit of a mega mix of Prime Minister's questions, where Sir Keir Starmer was really quite keen to talk about Gavin Williamson. Have a listen to this.
The member for South Staffordshire told a civil servant to slit their throat.
For the record, I did not know about any of the specific concerns relating to his conduct.
Everyone in the country knows someone like the member for South Staffordshire. Yeah. A sad middle manager getting off on intimidating those beneath him. Yeah. But everyone in the country also knows someone like the Prime Minister. Yeah. The boss who is so weak, so worried the bullies will turn on him, that he hides behind them.
Integrity in public life matters. And that is why it is right that the Right Honourable Member has resigned.
He's a pathetic bully. But he would never get away with it if people like the Prime Minister didn't hand him power.
I obviously regret appointing someone who has had to resign in these circumstances.
If he can't even stand up to a cartoon bully with a pet spider, what chance has he got of running the country?
The British people want real leadership on the serious global challenges we face, and that's what they'll get from this government.
That was Prime Minister's questions yesterday. Keir Starmer not really letting up on it as an issue, and with sort of some of the things we've already spoken about in mind. One thing to consider, Kirsty, I wonder if any of this, and this is potential speculation, but hey, let's go for it. Do you think any of this could have been riled up by Team Truss in some ways, or anything to gain there in some sort of revenge, or, you know, if we can take out a cabinet minister pretty quickly, then actually that's a bit of a slap in the face for Rishi Sunak? Is there anything in that, do you think?
No, I don't sense the hand of Team Truss here. I might feel that it might have been stoked a little bit by the hand of Team Boris, but I'm not entirely sure that Team Truss has got an awful lot to gain from this. I don't think there was any particular animus between Team Truss and Rishi in the way that there is and exists still between, you know, the arch acolytes and allies of Boris and Team Rishi. I do think, though, that, you know, listening to Keir, again, it comes back to the people in glass houses and throwing stones bit, isn't it? Like, having enforcers is, you know, in politics is as old as, you know, well, as I can remember. Tony Blair, Alistair Campbell, I've just been looking up to remember that, you know, Alistair Campbell was once, not accused, he did, accost Michael White, who was then the political editor of the Guardian, and physically accost him. So Theresa May had complaints about her own former aides, Nick Timothy and Fiona Hill, and some of their behaviour towards other cabinet ministers. You know, there is a long tradition, if you like, of bruises in politics. But the thing that most struck me about Keir yesterday, and kind of most annoyed me about his moral hobby horse that he'd climbed on, was, and back to the point that we were making last week about Rishi reminding people about this, and I think this is one of those points where I thought actually it is good to remind this. You know, Keir Starmer stood on a platform to elect Jeremy Corbyn to become the Prime Minister of the country, a man who allowed anti-Semitism to grow and fester within his party to such an extent that most of our British community were thinking about packing up and leaving the country if Jeremy Corbyn became the Prime Minister. So when you talk about Gavin Williamson and what he did or didn't say to Wendy Morton, it would be really nice if we just had a bit of kind of recent memory here and a sense of perspective here, because bullying or unacceptable behaviour or whatever you want to call it comes in many forms. And I think if you ask if the British Jewish community watched that exchange yesterday, they would have, you know, been struck by the rampant hypocrisy of it.